Have you just bought a boat and unfortunately when the engine's running, the batteries are not charging? You're fed up, you've tried a new battery, it's not that, it's something else. Well, there's a really simple test and something really easy to replace if it's the cause. Hi folks, it's Ash from Being SWENGLISH, and here in Sweden, almost everybody has a boat. At least if you live near the sea, that is. And Swedes love to go out cruising on the boat, fishing and enjoying life in general. So had a bit of a midlife crisis and bought one. But ever since I bought this boat, I've had problems with the battery. So when the engine is running on a boat, the engine will automatically charge the big 12-volt battery that you have in here, like the battery in your car. When the engine's running, it keeps the battery topped up and charged. However, with this boat, since I got it, start up the engine and the battery doesn't charge, and the problem there is if you went out to sea with a battery that ends up dead, you turn off your engine for a little break and put the anchor down and open up a non-alcoholic beer, and when you try and start the engine again, it won't. So I tried many things. I looked at the battery and tested it, and even tried a new battery to see if that would fix it, and still none of the batteries would charge via this engine. So I did one really easy test that you can do as well, which is to test the main 100 amp fuse in this engine. Now this is a Mercury 4-stroke, it's an 80 EFSI, and it's called a fusible link. It's quite common in lots of other outboard engines as well. So it's an easy thing to check. And the first thing we're going to do is just show you how I checked it. Now, an absolutely essential first step when doing anything with boat electronics is to disconnect the batteries first. What you don't want is to short anything whilst you're working on it, and that will just stop any risk of sparks or problems like that. First thing we need to do is get the cover off. This engine is an absolute beast, it's gigantic. And lift up the cover very carefully so you don't catch any of the wires, etc. And now we're going to go around to the other side. So we're now around the other side of this gigantic beast of an engine, and I actually know that my fusible link has blown because I've already tested it. I'm going to replace it in this video, but you will need a few tools to do that. But to do the test, you'll need a multimeter, and you'll need to set the multimeter to the continuity setting, which is this one here. And that setting basically will produce a tone when there is a link. So when I bridge these, you'll hear that beep. And what we're going to do is basically test this fusible link on both sides of it to see if it actually beeps. And if it does, we know it's not blown. If it doesn't beep, then we know it has. So on this Mercury engine, the fusible link actually runs from the alternator here. So we're going to take off this cap to expose the actual connector. And this is the end of the fusible link cable, which then runs down here. You can see it in this corrugated cable cover. It runs down along the bottom, along here, and then it runs back up, and you can actually see there is the fusible link itself. You can see on it as well that it actually says 100 on there as well. There you go. And that's the actual fuse in there that's most likely blown, and then it runs up to this diode point here. So I'm going to take the cover off there as well so we can access this. Now this engine seems to have been sprayed excessively with some sort of corrosion, anti-corrosion stuff, which I don't like. It's really yucky. But anyway, we can scratch a little bit of that away so we can get the multimeter testers on there, and then the other end on the alternator point here. Now it doesn't matter with this continuity test which way around you put these, so you can start with either, but they actually say it's a good idea to do it one way around and then actually switch around with the other, just to be sure. So I'm going to put one end on here, on the point where this fusible link actually terminates, and what I'll do is scratch a little bit of this anti-corrosion away just so I'm getting a good solid link. And then the other one I'm going to just put down here where I'll scratch a bit away as well, and there is absolutely no tone, which shows no continuity. I'll now switch them around and do exactly the same test again just to be sure. So one on that end there, and the other end down here, nothing. So if you get a tone, then it's not your fusible link that's blown. If you don't get a tone, then you will need a new one. So once I diagnosed that my fusible link had blown, I ordered another one. Luckily, the dealer that I bought the boat and the engine from sent this to me for free because it seemed that this had blown before I got the boat. I believe the cost of these, if you buy one new, is actually about $100 or so, which is crazy for a little bit of wire with a fuse built into it. But as with anything boat related, it's always going to be overpriced. And when I Googled to find the most possible causes for this, one of the most common is where the battery polarity has been switched. The battery on this boat wasn't installed brilliantly. It was quite loose in there, I noticed, and it's also been, I think, in and out a few times. And I suspect that when the battery's been put in, back in, the polarity's been the wrong way around, and that basically causes that fusible link to pop almost immediately. The engine may still run absolutely perfectly, but it won't charge the battery. This is the easiest thing to test if you've got a battery charging problem. The fusible link is the most simple first test to make, and then at least it can give you an idea as to the cause. So what we're going to do now is fit this. You're going to need a 13mm spanner or a socket set in order to undo the point here. You'll also need some little wire cutters because quite often the wires or the cables which it runs through along here is often zip tied to all the other cables. So a way to cut those is also a good idea. So the first thing I'm going to do down here, as you can see, the wire loom runs through these. So I'm just going to clip these. Be very careful when you're doing this, not to cut through actual cables because that will be a very expensive repair. And I mean very, very expensive. So I'm now going to cut through this. It can be quite fiddly to get in these. These outboards are incredibly compact in how they're designed. You'll also need some of these clips, wire ties or zip ties, so that you can actually replace them and keep everything nice and neat and in order. So that's now those cuts, so we can now get access to the actual loom. What I'm now going to do is actually undo this nut here with the 13mm spanner so that I can then start to remove the existing one. It's also a good idea to take photos of everything so you know how it's routed and where it goes. I can see that the existing one attaches here, it goes around behind here, and then you can see it pop out from below the ECU, which is the electronic control unit just there. Another zip tie here, and then it goes down and then into this normal loom with everything else. So the zip ties I've now clipped, I'm gonna pull out. Let's keep it nice and tidy. And there's 4 in total, but this can vary depending on how much maintenance and work your engine's had in the past. There's also this other zip tie here, which I'm also going to cut. And there's a little zip tie holder there as well, which is nice. So again, as I mentioned, keep a note of where everything's routed so that you can easily put it all back in place. So I'm now ready to route the new cable, and I'm actually going to start from the alternator end. And the reason is I've got to thread it down through this behind the ECU. It's much easier to thread this harder, more solid piece through down there than it will be to thread this more flexible piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is undo this one here, attach the new cable, and then slowly and gently pull the old one out and then thread this new one in. So this first nut here is actually a 10mm, so you need a 10mm socket set. We'll undo that one very gently. Again, there's some anti-corrosion on this, which is mucky stuff, but I guess if it keeps everything from corroding, then it's not a bad thing. So we'll take that off first. Also be careful not to drop any components down into the actual tray of the engine down there, because it can actually be hard to get them back. Now that the old cable is off, by moving that, you can see just how easily and freely this moves actually. So what I'll do is thread the new cable up through there and feel my way like that, pull it up through, and now I can actually clip that directly in place, attach the screw. If this was all corroded underneath, I'd be sanding that down a little bit with some wire wool, but it's actually in really good condition. There's some copper grease on there, I think. And then I will tighten that up. And make sure you don't over tighten these, but do tighten them so that they're nice and snug, obviously. And that is there. Don't over tighten it, because this, you can strip everything and break things. That's nice and tight. And I'm now going to put the protective sleeve back over that. And now we can actually remove I'll start to pull out the old cable. But the benefit of doing it this way is that it gives me a visual clue of where the new cable goes. So by following the old cable that I've just pulled out there, I can now also thread the new cable in and down where the old one goes. Be very careful not to damage that new fuse piece. Like that. There we go. That's in there nice and neatly now. I can now also start to pull out the old cable from this bit, which routes under here. I do notice that the sleeve cover is a slightly different colour on this new cable. There we go, all finished. So that's the old cable now removed from there. I'll now continue to thread the new cable along in its path. So I'll now pull out the old cable from under here and thread the new one under. I'm not going to zip tie anything back in just yet. I'll do that when I've finished. So you see the old cable now goes through under here. So I'll thread the new cable in the same path. Again, being really, really careful with this fuse link, being careful not to twist anything. Quite shocking to think that the actual engineers, if you take this to a dealer, charge an absolute fortune to do this. A couple of hours of labor, I think. I don't know why it's hours of labor. So this could amount to hundreds of dollars somehow. So now we actually have the new fusible link next to the old one here. You can see the two side by side, and actually I do wonder, when this is possible to blow, why they didn't just use a replaceable fuse instead of an actual cable. It does seem like an absolute waste of money. I was even tempted to cut this old one out and put a fuse holder in here that would cater for a 100 amp fuse, but I just thought, let's do it properly this first time and hopefully it'll never blow ever again. So before I pull the old cable out completely, I'm going to undo this nut. You'll need your 13mm socket to undo that one. And again, it has a lot of anti-corrosion stuff on there. And again, undo it gently, like so. There are also, unlike the other end of this cable, a lot of additional cables attached to this. So you've got to be very careful not to lose them all and to make sure that you attach each and every one of them when you replace it. So I'm going to take the nut off first and put that to one side. You can now see that our fusible link is actually one of about, I think, 5 in total on here. So I'm going to take this one off first. There's now another one, which is, there's actually a washer on there. So I'll make sure I put that back in. That's actually an anti-vibration washer. That should have, I would suggest, have been on last. Oddly, it's not. So whoever did this last time didn't do a very good job. The fusible link is actually the second, so I'll keep that to one side. I'll now put our new fusible link on there. Make sure it's not under any stress. I'll put it on the right way around. I'll then put this one back on. So there are just 2 on there, but you can see lots more behind. And then put our anti-vibration washer on top. And then we'll put the nut back on. So again, be very careful not to drop it down into the tray of the engine because it can be hard to get it back. And I'll now use my socket set to tighten that back up. Again, don't over tighten it. Make sure that you just tighten it as tight as it needs to be. There are probably torque settings for this, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to do it nip tight. And now what we can actually do is pull the whole of the old cable out like that. There we go. So it is that simple to replace. Now I haven't zip tied anything yet. And before I do so, just for peace of mind, I'm going to pull out the multimeter again. So I'm going to put it on the original point and then on the other end. And there's our beep. So now we know it's all working. So the zip ties I've got are these. You can get them from any DIY store, but they're just like the originals. The only thing you want to do is once you've zip tied, make sure that you cut the excess off with your wire cutters. This can be quite a fiddly job getting in here, but this is the first zip tie that I undid. So I'm going to pop that one through the little zip tie holder that's actually attached to the engine. Then bend it around and bring it back around to include our new cable like that. I'm actually going to put it around just these two. I don't need it around that, what looks like a fuel hose, and do it like that. And then, as I said, cut off the excess. Doesn't need to be overly tight, like that. Now actually, I would argue as to whether it's really essential to zip tie these at all. The cables are really snug down there and secure, so actually I'm not going to bother. But what I will do is zip tie these here, because they are slightly flexible and can move around a little bit. So I will just put a zip tie around those, but the rest I would say are unnecessary and over the top. There is no inbuilt holder down here. In fact, the very point that the engine only has a zip tie holder on the other side suggests that this is not necessary over here. So everything is nice and solid there, and I'm quite happy with that. I'm now going to actually fire up the engine, turn it all on, and make sure that it's now charging. Always make sure that you use one of these, which you clamp onto the bottom of the engine and provides it with water when you're running it, not in water itself. However, don't rev up the engine too high when you're using these. Idle or just about idle is safe. So just before I actually get the engine running again, I'm going to reconnect the batteries, which we disconnected before starting. I'm then going to turn the ignition on and just make sure that the continuity with the fusible link is maintained. In other words, when I turn the electrics back on, that it doesn't blow straight away again. So that's the positive terminals put back on the battery, and we're now ready to turn on the ignition. Just another note that when you do take the terminals off the battery, make sure that you cover them or surround them in some respect so you can't short or spark anything. These batteries are very powerful, and if you do spark or short them, you can actually destroy the battery itself. So ignition is on, everything seems good. I'm now going to check the continuity. Again, shorting these gives me a beep. So I'm just going to check that my fusible link is still working. Yep. We have a beep. We're ready to turn on. So I'm going to first of all turn the hose pipe on so that the engine's getting a water supply for its cooling, and then I'll start the ignition. Fingers crossed, or as they say in Sweden, hålla tummarna, holding thumbs. So as you can see, the starting voltage is 12.3. Once I start the engine, if we know it's all working, then that voltage will start to rise. This is super exciting. Okay, water's on. It's the moment of truth. Starting the engines. 12.3. Oh, 14.4. There we go. That is absolutely brilliant. I can't tell you how happy I am about that. That was the simplest fix ever. What I'm going to do is actually leave it running for a little bit to charge the batteries. You can see it's healthy stream of water here out of the cooling system, even on idle. And the charge is also really healthy as well, rising from 12.3 up to 14 volts at idle without even revving the engine. So I've just put the cover back on, and I can't tell you how happy I am. This problem has persisted for months since I bought this boat. We thought it was the battery, we thought it was other things. I even bought a brand new battery, installed a dual charging system, turned it on, and it still wasn't working. So to have just replaced one simple little cable with a fuse built into it, for that to have fixed everything, I am super happy. I'm actually going to leave the engine running for a little bit now to put some charge in the battery, but that's as simple as it was. If you've got any questions about how to do this, just comment below, but it's really, really simple. One of the key things to remember is to disconnect the batteries before you start doing anything, otherwise you risk damaging or blowing other elements or diodes within the engine. As I mentioned, the common symptom is that your batteries won't charge. Now, there can be other reasons for that, but the key thing to test is the fusible link, because it's so easy to test. Anybody can test it with a multimeter. So check that first. Comment below on this video anyway. I know it wasn't quite Sweden related, but I'm in Sweden, and so why not? Anyway, hope you enjoyed it, and thanks very much for watching. Cheers.